We are about ready to, I think, get started again, and it's one of those moments when I just realized that I left my phone at home. I know, isn't that feeling of, oh no, what have I done? So I clearly, I don't need it for the next hour and 15 minutes, but it was one of those moments of realizing, oh man, I've gone away. You feel naked. You feel like, what did I leave? And isn't that sad? I mean, actually, that speaks volumes about how I don't, regrettably, I fear, live in a community that has some of the characteristics that we're going to look at in that one article that I sent you from the New York Times. But we'll get there in a few minutes. But I think it shows how much I fall short of living in that myself.
Did you have yogurt this morning?
I didn't, but I should. We're going to talk more about that. We're going to think.
If you're not a teenager, you can't test.
That's right. That's right. I'd really be out of touch. That's right. You're exactly right. And we're going to get back to something. Well, let's sort of set our frame today with following up from where we were last week, and then thinking more as we with our last sort of our looking toward next week together, when we're going to kind of walk through some of the big picture again, using Hannah Coulter as our context for that I know a number of you have read, and I look forward to just talking about that story with you in so many ways. But first, to sort of get us focused again on this notion of community, and then before we look at that, especially that one article together, I want to bring you back to Warren's comments on human flourishing. And part of this is, again, to remind us, when we talk about this dynamic of human flourishing or health, just to, again, it's not, there are a lot of ways to say this, but it is not self-interpreting. We don't just, I would propose to you, we don't just, get up and say, I'm going to be healthy, and I have my own notion of that's independent of the world around me about what health looks like. I think we're much more interdependent than that. We're much more dependent on our neighbors and you may say, well, but we've been taught. I mean, isn't it the American way that we're supposed to stand on our own 2 feet, make our own decisions about what's good and what's... I think that's a misnomer. I think that may be what most of us have been taught in many ways, but I'm not confident it serves us well. I'm not confident that notion, nor am I confident that it's realistic. That it really, that in reality, we are interdependent for having this sense of what the good is, or what it might look like to have health and human flourishing. So it's not self-interpreting, nor is its discernment a matter of individualistic, subjective judgment about the states of one's own life. Again, this avoidance of the presumption of that it's my own assessment of, is this healthy, is this human flourishing, etc. Human flourishing, rather, is discerned by those sufficiently habituated in virtue so as to have the eyes to recognize flourishing where it appears. And we're going to talk some more today about some of those kinds of what those virtues might look like, and what are the characteristics, and we're going to try to have some examples for that, etc. But again, I take you back to this quote that we see over and over again with me because it's so, I think, central. Looked at it last week, again from Barry. Health is not just a sense of completeness in ourselves, but also is a sense of belonging to others and to our place. An unconscious awareness of community, of having in common. Just that reminder again and again of what health and human flourishing, that interdependency, belonging to others and to our place. And one of the things that I'm reminded of when I read these kinds of things by Barry, as well as when I read it was such a gift to me, that article about Icaria, the island off of Greece, with what we're kind of thinking about and talking about together. I admit it stirs so many conflicting feelings for me, because on one level, I read about it and I want us to look at some of it together, but then, to be honest with you, it reminds me what I don't have. right? Or I don't, at least. I mean, I'm confessing that I don't. We make attempts for that in various ways. I see one of my colleagues from that I work with a little bit at Blake for communities that we really may have some intentionality, such as Blakeford and others, to try to say we will have some of these practices, and we will. And I commend it. I'm a real supporter of it, but we fall short in so many ways. It's hard to come by. But I won't let. I want to. At least, you may call me Don Quixote tilting at windmills, but I'm going to keep doing it because I believe we have to keep trying on this. I won't. I just can't give up. Yes, Dr. Hargrove.
Keith, I'm thinking of Sinclair novels, Main Street, and the novel Vanderbilt, in which community is oppressive. How do we put that in?
The point Dr. Hargrove is making, and we do need to acknowledge that, and we need to come back around to it. And actually, we'll even link one piece of that into this conversation that the little island off of Greece brings up, of the reality that communities can be oppressive. And we've all probably experienced some of that. So how does that work? And that's an important dynamic, and it's a crucial acknowledgement. And I think some of our obsession with individualism may be a reaction to the oppressiveness of some communities historically. But it's that old pendulum swing that we've seen so much throughout history of that's understandable, and we legitimately people respond to that oppressiveness of communities and have all sorts of certain types of reaction to it. And religious communities can be the worst for some of that oppressiveness. They really can. But then when we react to that and throw that out, it's the baby with the bathwater notion. We need to get, when we feel like we need to get rid of that, then what are we losing? And is there a way to negotiate a middle way? A way where we can not be captive to the negative, oppressive components of a community, but yet have some of the really beneficial components that I think may relate to health and human flourishing that we've been looking at and talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't this the biblical concept of having to push away from it, prodigal, and so forth, to get away of what you perceive to be oppressive in order that you can see what else is there and find your way back?
Some of that it's nicely said. Some of that balance, some of that finding of, and we are always in those dynamics, aren't we? Aren't we? I mean, we see it in our own lives in a lot of different ways. But again, using the kind of the story that I've chosen of today. I mean, even this gentleman who I would speculate that there are absolutely people, probably in this world that we might could find, who wanted to get away from the island of Icaria. Part of their yearning, I can just imagine, I'm making this up for sure, but I can imagine a young person who's felt oppressed and just felt like everybody was hovering around them on this island. And they were I want my life. I've got to get away from this family all around me. We're too small here. I want to go to Athens, right? I want to go to New York. We all have our versions. I mean, how many people know some story? And I realize that folks have grown up in all different settings around here. But because I grew up in a small town in the South, I can identify with the notion of how many people have experienced, whether it's in the South or another, some form of a small town that the yearning is to get away from it. The hope is to, how am I going to get out? When am I going to get away? When will I not have everyone around me knowing my parents and reporting on me? And or some version of the above. Yes?
As a registered nurse working in ICU and CCU, cardiac, we've known for 30 years that more heart attacks happen at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. And even the American Heart Association will say that, as well as obesity and smoking and genetics and all that, it's the #1 precursor for heart attacks. Job dissatisfaction and hostility in the work environment. So you can look at that, and then epigenetics, which is how our genes are expressed. All the research in neuroscience says that the environment, the culture, the immediate circumstances and your surroundings can be very deleterious to your health.
And what I would take from what you're saying to extrapolate on that a bit is that 9 o'clock on Monday morning notion of when people are leaving the context where they might feel more supported in some ways and going into the workplace with the potential hostilities, etc., the vulnerabilities are enhanced there, and they feel that. I think that's so. And we're going to come back to that. But this notion, I think, is really important. I appreciate Dr. Hargrove noting it of that. There's the valence can be positive or negative around communities, but how do we think about that? And then I want us to keep thinking together of then bring it back to our own stories and the stories we know of people. And then, because I really want us to challenge ourselves of how are we going to think about this relationship of communities of faith and practice, and how do they relate to health through some of this mechanism that I'm alluding to and talking with you about with regard to communities. And it absolutely can be negative, but how do we make the most of what we understand to be positive? And how might we, as communities living together, be more intentional about that? Now, yes, ma'am.
Don't you think one of the issues is that some communities, rather than being heterogeneous, become very homogeneous?
To the point of an exclusivity.
Absolutely. And an exclusion of ideas and thoughts and people eventually. And I think that's true of many communities, many neighborhoods even, where that becomes the case. And we could be intentional, and some communities are intentional about opening up and becoming, a heterogeneous community. But more than often, it's the other way.
And-
Quite frequently.
I think point well taken, but being honest with ourselves of how it's a delicate balance of how how do we, another way of thinking about this as we continue to talk about it is how do we establish and then sustain communities that have enough of a common story and language that one can feel like, oh, I belong, right? Because I think that is, how do you have enough of a common story to say we belong with one another while still being open to possibilities of distinctiveness and difference? And do you see what it's because I want to be careful to not overly naively assume some notion of, just mixing everybody as diverse and different as they can be together is always a good as well. I want to challenge us to be careful about that, because I think it's easy for people to start to feel like, if you've ever been in that setting, because I have been sometimes, when I felt like, I don't really belong here, do I? So we've got to think about that. How do we nurture communities where people can belong, but then be communities that are welcoming and hospitable, right? That's an important dynamic that I think we have. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Another dimension for a community, though, needs to be the one of human flourishing within the community, because games, nearly all games, thrive on the sense of belonging.
Absolutely. That's wonderfully. Through the gangs, one of the examples I've used through the years talking about this at times is, a very, very tightly, a lot of loyalty and committed community, the mafia. It's a very functional community, right? Gangs are just a great example of it. That's right. Great point of that we have to keep in mind that, again, all of the negative possibilities and implications, if not formed by particular virtues, if communities, and that's part of what we're talking about today. You guys are great. You're leading me on. So if the communities that we're talking about providing some of this context by which you might nurture an Icaria experience on some level, if they are not formed by particular virtues, then I think it can be very problematic. Because the power of, this, walk back with me, the power of a community, I'm going to be pretty assertive on. I think communities are powerful. And that gang example is a wonderful one, or the mafia, or whatever. And so the key, if we believe in the power of communities and their potential oppressiveness, etc., then it becomes all the more important the virtues by which they're formed and what kind of characteristics a community has, which is some of what you were alluding to. What kind of virtues are they formed by? And we're going to be talking about this. Now, one of this was, you guys made me think about it last week, and so I wanted to bring it back to you this week, and point out how I think it's so accurate, but there's more to it. Does poverty, this was an article that I mentioned last week and wanted to just share with you again and note was, because I think it's a wonderful article, does poverty make you sick? We were talking about some of the socioeconomic issues and how they relate to health and human flourishing and how there are real limitations with regards to poverty. And that's true. I think the evidence is there. I mean, that significant socioeconomic deficits contribute to limits in human flourishing and health in some ways. And so I talk about it, social determinants of health are important to me. And I talk about it because, this is a slide I've had for, and the poverty clinic, where they address multiple issues with it in San Francisco, in this clinic, are important. But the point but there's more to it than that. And that's the key that I want us to think about when we think about some of these notions of community we're talking about. There's more to it than just because I do believe, and when we look at a carrier, whether we look at rural communities, etc., that I can think of, and variety of, it's not, being poor in and of itself does not limit the potential for human flourishing. Now, I would hope and pray that none are poor, okay? Because I do think that there is a relationship here, that it does contribute to illness and sickness and limitations. But I don't think it's the only variable, and I think there are a lot of other contributors that are in dynamic with it. And so I want us to think together about what are the other factors that might be involved, and then particularly, what are some of the other factors that might mitigate when there are limitations in socioeconomic status. And this is just one of the quotes from that story. It's not a me place, it's an us place. That this island of Icaria, it's not a me place, it's an us place. And what that means, what are the implications of that? What's the significance of something being an us place? And when we go back to the notions of what Barry has said to us about the sense of belonging, etc., I want to some way challenge us to work with this notion that you guys are already often going on of thinking about community, but what it means to be an us place, not a me place, and how does that get incorporated into daily practices that have a real impact on our health and our ability to flourish in some ways? Yes, ma'am. Or either one, and then we'll.
It seems to me, in talking to people who live in poverty and are surrounded with a community of poverty, the big thing that's lacking is hope.
Mm-hmm.
They feel hopeless, and they feel no matter what they do, it's hopeless, and so they don't feel that they can ever get out of that. And the community around them seems to feel the same way. Whereas when this individual went to the island and he had lung cancer and he was expected to die, then he got on the island, and I think the people there had a feeling of hope and everything was going to be all right, and I think he responded to that as much as anything.
And so, and I'll come right back to, and along that line, she's talking about the hope of this gentleman when he goes back to the island of Icaria with this diagnosis of lung cancer that his U.S. doctors have told him probably, it's a matter of months that he has to live. So, I mean, he believes them, so he goes home to Icaria to live out his life, right? That's the notion of, and so another angle on that I want is where does the hope come from? How do we get hope? What gives people hope, even when situations are not ideal, or not? I'm going to be plugging in some ways that there's on some level it's about relationships. It's about people. It's about context where one has a group of folks who say, it's about us, not about me. It's about where they really believe it's an us phenomenon. And we've probably all been in times in our lives when we felt like we were sort of a me alone, and when we thought, no, I'm part of an us. And we know the difference. And the argument I'm making with you is that I think there's data, I showed you data early on, I think there's data that supports that being part of us is associated with health in certain ways, with better health. And so what I want to do is then continue to build on the conceptual notions and encouragement. How do we do that, though, in respect to the kind of questions that have all been coming up? Okay, how do we do that without bringing on some of the negative valence and connotations at times? And what would make the difference? And that's where I would propose to you communities formed in particular virtues, which I think faith communities can have, while they can also not have those virtues. But I think formed in particular virtues that we're going to talk about can make all the difference. Yes, ma'am. And then there's back here.
Well, what is an us place? I guess to go back to the gentleman with the lung cancer as well, it's a place of sharing. It's a place of caring.
Sharing, caring.
And if one person's crops don't come in, even though they're poor, the other people in the community will feed that family.
They talked about that, didn't they?
It's more of a selfless place. And I think for this guy, I think when he got there, initially he was depressed and I'm going to die. And little by little, he started to focus on walking. He planted a garden. He started to do things. And so he wasn't focusing on me and I'm going to die and I have lung cancer. He started focusing outward instead of inward. And I think that probably, and the support he had from his friends and family and neighbors probably helped him. Why the cancer went away, nobody really knows.
We don't have the answer to that question, do we?
Know,
But
it helped him to become more positive in mood and spirit in terms of his whole outlook on life.
Well, in some of the spirit of what you're describing, and I know we've got 2 points to be made, some of the spirit of what you're describing with that group, I just want to, I loved the example of when they talked about the festival days. And people don't get to just stay in the house on festival days. Somebody comes and tells them, come on out. We're having a party. We expect you to be here, right? Now, in America, what do we do if somebody, well, what's your business? What are you doing on my front doorstep? We're private. We don't. I thought it was intriguing, and you may feel like, yeah, Keith, and that's why I don't want to live in a area where they talk about they don't think of privacy. They don't think of privacy in the same way. The idea is there's a party on the street. We're having a festival day. You've got to come on out. And there's been times in my life, and I've shared some of that with you all after my wife's death, etc., that I needed people to just say, no, Keith, you can't just sit. You got to come on out. I know you don't feel like it right now, but you've got to come on out. We need communities that'll do that sometimes and say, you've got to come on out. This back there, and then this. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I think contributed to his overall well-being is he went home and he was accepted.
I'm just keywords that people are saying. Was accepted.
For whatever his situation was, and they would just surround him and let him be, and bit by bit, maybe they encouraged him to
walk and plant the garden, or maybe he just took this by osmosis, shall we say.
I'd like to propose on one level, it was the common practice. Everybody had gardens, right? Everybody had gardens. Everybody had to walk up and down the hills to get to the market, to get some food for the day. Practices. There were common practices in the community that embodied certain virtues, etc., etc. Yes, and then here, and then...
Well, I just think of a few words. It was a communal outlook instead of an individual outlook.
Amen. A communal outlook instead of an individual outlook. Literally, when you use the word outlook, could I twist that just a little bit to worldview? It's literally a way of life, right? A communal way of life versus an individualistic way of life. And again, I'm not trying to say all or nothing on some of this, because I understand that at times there may be the feeling of, it's not meaning that we don't have some individualism, etc. But I want us to get the difference of what it means, a communal way of life versus an individualistic way of life. Yes, ma'am.
A famous cardiologist, Dr. Dean Ornish, who was even President Clinton's heart doctor, was suicidal because he spent too much of his time on an academic. And so he started doing research on this. And one of his famous studies in Love and Survival, which was a landmark book about what he was speaking of, there was a Rosetta village in Pennsylvania. They were Italian, they were very poor, they ate fatty food, they drank too much, they were sedentary. But they noticed that in the nearby town, which is more affluent, had great hospitals and all, that the people in Rosetta were so healthy, despite all their unhealthy living habits. And it was because they were Italian, they were incredibly close-knit, they had community.
They had a community.
Come in unity.
They had community, and they knew how to love one another. I'm going to keep using the word, some guys. We talked about it last week. We're going to talk about it again today. And again, in a very robust and textured way, they knew how to love one. They know how to love one another. Yes, ma'am.
My husband was dying of a brain tumor. I felt really surrounded by a community of friends and community of church.
And made a difference, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Made a difference. I mean,
Where? It was in Kansas City.
I appreciate that question. Yeah, where was it? Yeah, I mean, and I'm making this up, but I hear within that kind of like, wasn't in Nashville. I mean, and I'm kidding with you. You didn't say that, but I'm sort of like, well, when you're saying, where was it? And I think that's a very appropriate question. Where was it, and how did it happen? And how could we do it? And then I think the follow-up question that has to be, and how could we do it better? I mean, yes, ma'am.
Well, I think part of the thing about the friends is you're kind of working on that your whole life. I mean, it didn't just happen the year he was diagnosed.
That's right. Well, and I just would love to take that. I mean, it goes way back philosophically. That's profound what she just said. You've been working on it your whole life. You don't just get up one day and say, I think I'm going to have friends, right? I'm going to have a community. No, we're formed for it. And now we need to acknowledge some folks have had had more opportunities to be formed for that. And that's where then intentional communities of faith and practice come into play to sort of say, you haven't had the same opportunities to be formed in that. Take my hand. Let me help you. Right? Because some people, it's not as natural. I think there were some. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say that sometimes events can bring a community closer. And I think Nashville had a flood in 2010 that created, at least for a while, a real sense of caring for one another.
I think.
Still had a baseball team this summer.
No, that's.
Part of that.
I agree with you. I confess to you, when I was reading about that team and those little boys, I loved those. I don't know those little boys, but I was sort of stirred of like, now this is good stuff. This is good stuff.
I made friends with a team from Uganda.
Yep.
They're raising money to go at Christmas break, to go there and help them equip a baseball field.
No, I'm right with
And
that.
think of the hours of dedication those volunteer coaches gave to those dogs over the years.
Mhm.
And the parents at their own expense going to all those tournaments and supporting those kids. That's absolutely wonderful.
Well,
And I wonder if in those families, that is what we used to call the generation gap.
right.
I think that's a division that we used to hear a lot about. And I think we just forgotten to say it anymore. The generation gap. What can draw people our age to kids anymore?
And the principle and what I want to underline, because I love what you're saying, is the notion of intentionality. How do we get past waiting for the event? You know, I mean, or the episode, that's good when it happens, but how do we foster daily intentionality in communities of practice, faith and practice, that will form these contexts that will be health-giving and flourishing for folks? And I really, I want us to ponder the significance of really thinking about this together versus sort of hoping, I'm really not interested in being nice to one another. You know, I mean, that's just sort of pathetic to me. Nice to one another, I want more than that. I want a robust sense of what it means to care intentionally for one another. I think there was someone, yes ma'am.
Well, I can give you an example of non-community.
Okay, good, we need that.
My husband was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and he went to the Cleveland Clinic for treatment. So I went there too, and I didn't have a community there.
Yeah.
That was miles from where my community was. And I think he died September the 2nd of 1995. And in December, I had depression. But I think that's an example of
No,
non-community.
and you'd felt alone in that, hadn't you? I mean, because this is we're actually going to look at a one quote from Barry that I want to use to bring it back to even notions of how do places of health care, okay? I mean, hospitals, etc. How might we foster more in this interaction of religion and health and these kind of things we're talking about? How might we have more intentionality about what a hospital could be? How could it be more of a community? How could we do better in health care about some of these things?
One thing we had were social workers who meet you at the door.
They did have that?
Yes.
But you still felt alone in some way. I mean, I want to say, I just think we can do better in certain ways. Yes, ma'am, and then, yes, ma'am.
I think the idea of what's in it for me is part of our culture that we're not aware of until we live in another culture. And I was born into Vanderbilt, lived for 20 years on the continent of Africa with people who had a communal way of living. If you would go into a home and see what they had and how they managed, I can tell you none of us would last a week. And the way of organizing things, getting water, having food to eat, all of that is a part of communal living. Terrible health care, lots of problems to overcome. But at the same time, any problem a person had was everybody's problem.
Yes.
I mean, they just accepted that. And I think the weakness of those communities
Yes, ma'am.
is that they tend not to do anything new. It's harder for them to do new things, to try new seed and so on. But their intensity of maintaining everything for everybody is what helps them. So I think what we're talking about now is how can our society, which has the ability to be creative, to do new things,
That's right.
and so on, learns how to feel like we're part of a community. And how can we support everybody to have all that? That's our health.
It's wonderful what she has just named for us. I mean, it is a great example of it. I mean, I have one daughter who I think she just loves Africa for the very reasons you're describing. She spent 6 months in part of Tanzania, and I tried to listen and learn with her along the way, and what I think she loved most was it was a taste of that for her, of that, what you were calling a communal way of life, but you're pointing out but that can become captive to its own patterns and not have a way of making some progression in certain ways. And I think you're nicely pointing out we've got to keep that, what I would want to call a dynamic tension of how do we have some notion of the community that's embodied in this description we have here and what I think can be when formed by proper virtues, but yet an openness to, but how can we do better? How can we, and one of the phrases that I'm going to be talking with you about is the notion of hospitality. If we are formed in ways, if communities practice hospitality, there will be the possibility of, a new way, we can learn from someone with it, but yet maintain the sense of the communal life. So I think you're quite right to point out that issue and the need for it. Yes, sir, you've been waiting back there.
Well, you were talking about intentional communities. It struck me that the street vendors' papers.
Say this again. Street vendors' papers.
In Nashville.
Okay.
Out of Presbyterian Church.
Yep.
Is that an effort, intentional effort to build community?
I think it is a nice example. The contributor, is that like selling? I think that is a nice example of an effort by a community of faith and practice to build with intentionality. How do we nurture a sense of inclusion of homeless men and women, and how do we make this? How do we have some intentionality about that rather than just saying, "Oh, we can't do anything. It's hopeless. How can we do it?" No, I think that is a nice example. Yes, ma'am.
The idea of a community, or communal living, is a huge, huge problem and task in this society. It's very easily done on the banks of a river in a little village in Namibia. But if you're talking about Nashville on the banks of the Cumberland, you got a huge problem.
And when you say Nashville on the banks of the Cumberland, there's so much wrapped up in that. I understand what you're saying. No, I'm with you. We're going to come. We got to keep coming back. We're going to come back to it.
It once was on the banks of the Cumberland, though.
It once was a village on the banks of the Cumberland. but yes, ma'am.
Well, I think one thing churches and other groups can do is foster groups and small groups.
Yep. Small. It has to be. There has to be some small. Yes, ma'am.
I spent 20 years in the Air Force Nurse Corps, and I did aeromedical evacuation in Korea and in Vietnam, and I've been out a long time. My husband and I came to Vanderbilt from Boston, and I think I never wanted to live here because I wanted to live in Washington, D.C. or live in San Antonio to be around people that I knew.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided to stay here. He died 10 years ago. And I think that we in the military take care of each other.
Yep.
Very much.
I think that's true.
I belong to 7 veterans groups here. I take care of the homeless, men and women veterans. And I don't know, but I'm here alone. My entire family is dead. And, I work at it.
That's part of that intention. I really respect so much what you work at it. It does take work, doesn't it? It doesn't just happen, right? It doesn't just happen. It is a working at it. And some of what we're going to be talking, it gives you purpose, right? There's a meaningfulness in it.
I'm going to be 83 years old, and I could just go and die if I wanted to.
Well, we're glad you're not. We're glad you're but see, I think I'm going to use a little paraphrase of this article. I'm just delighted that you're too busy and therefore you forget to die. Part of the notion of these people were on this island, I think they're too busy living, so they forget to die. You know, they're living. I loved when they were talking about. I love the images because the article in the paper had a number of pictures. I love the images of them dancing for their festivals. You know, these folks dancing for the and even one night where it talked about them pushing the things away, pushing the tables back. That's right, because it was time for them to dance. And I thought, you know, I'm probably a little younger than they are, and I'm too embarrassed to dance. I mean, I give them a ton of credit that they're push the tables back. It's time for us to dance. Yes, sir. I think.
She mentioned, I think, the most important factor in a group where it's an us place. There is a component of giving and a component of receiving, and by far the most important of those is the component of giving. For us to have a meaningful job and people who depend on us and respect us and see that we're doing something for others, that's the most important thing. I have a niece who, right out of college, got a job with a Native American tribe that had a lot of money. They had a gambling casino. They didn't run them themselves. It was all out on a contract to some corporation. And every man, woman, and child in that Indian tribe got a huge check every year. They had absolutely no reason to want to work at all. The pathologies of drugs and alcoholism and teenage pregnancy, all of those things were off the chart the way you would expect to see them in advanced poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But they were experiencing a poverty of the character because none of them felt the need to go out and do anything for anybody else.
A poverty of spirit, meaningfulness,
Right.
and hope, right? Because,
It's the giving that's more important than the receiving.
I think well said, and of profound theological significance too. I will. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to bring it down to a different level, and I'm remembering what you said about your wife going into 7-Eleven and having a
Oh, yeah.
conversation.
All right.
I believe that's a very important part of forming a community, because there's so many people that we come in contact with who have no sense of place, who have no sense of belonging. And I've had similar experiences. I went to have, my car checked out to get my tag, etc. The young man who was there was a young African American. He looked so unhappy, so sullen, so miserable. But I'm rather like your wife, and so I struck up this conversation, and I told him, "Gee, you were so efficient." He just broke out into a big grin and talked, and I think that that's true of a lot of people, that you can feel a sense of community with the people who are the checkout counter at the grocery store. That you don't have to find a specific identified community. You can infuse yourself into the larger community by reaching out to people and just acknowledging, they're there and what they're doing. And, a lot of people don't do this. We've always prided ourselves in the South for being friendly, but sometimes it's pretty superficial.
All right. No, and there are different levels of intensity of community, but you're naming one very real notion of just basic human hospitality to one another, of saying, and greeting one another. Yes, ma'am.
And talking about basic humanity and evolution, it's believed that 800,000 years ago, life began with a single cell, just a blob of cytoplasm. It split, it divided, and then it became a colony. It became a community, and then it became more and more communities. So it's believed that life began in small cellular communities, and then each community became adapted through evolution, selective evolution, to become a certain part of what became the body. Each one had a job. And that's literally how we came to be, that we have to be part of a community, and it obviously developed through eons.
Well, one of the things I want to share with you at one point, whether we get today or if it's next week, I have a quote from a book called, I want to name this book to you, Super Cooperators, by Martin Nowak. He's a Harvard mathematician and biologist, and I think that's an intriguing combination. And he's Catholic. He has a root in a faith tradition. That doesn't come through in this book at all. I just happen to know that about him. But this book is, and it's been challenged by a number of people because, I mean, it's stirred up a lot of, but he's a renowned member of the faculty at Harvard who has made the argument based on sort of evolutionary theory that cooperation is central to successful evolution. Whereas they're kind of and I'm grossly oversimplifying this, so forgive me for that if we have evolutionary biologists in the room, but I mean, it's in contradistinction to the folks who have been so committed to, no, it's always survival of the fittest, the simplest, a very straight Darwinian model on that. What Nowak and some others have really pointed out through very complex mathematics, et cetera, to establish that actually central to evolution and to our, quote, success as a species is cooperation.
Tell that to Congress.
No. Well, no, actually, it's shown by the lack of that cooperation is taking its negative effects, I fear, in so many ways. But no, it's a very nice point. And yes, sir, in the back.
It seems to me that there's another side of community that we tend to overlook, and I'm not sure if it comes out of our American individuality or if it comes out of our faith base, but it's caught up in the same. It's more blessed to give than to receive, and it's a lot easier.
Say that. I think I hear. I think I'm with. I hear what you're saying. A lot easier to give. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think the point he's making is so important in talking about communal way of life. Of one of the parts for us, and I think particularly I think as Americans, possibly Western in general. I don't want to be too culturally specific on to receive a gift. Do you know how hard that is sometimes for people? I mean, because we feel like that makes us dependent. We're fearful of dependence. We don't, and this gets back to the notion of interdependence of health and human flourishing. Learning to receive a gift is crucial. And we're going to be talking some more about gratitude. I think it is central to human flourishing. I will propose to you that and challenge you to think with me about gratitude. How do we experience it? How do we understand it? Do we know it in our lives? And it's interrelated with receiving a gift and not being afraid to receive a gift. And I think it's a point well made. And we need to keep thinking about it because it is a tendency while I know there's the notion of giving, which I honor very much, and the important. And I think we all understand the significance of that in ways. But you're pointing out the importance of receiving a gift. We're going to absolutely come back to. Yes, Joyce.
My mother used to be very upset by my paternal grandmother. She'd give her a gift.
That's her mother-in-law. No. Her mother-in-law. Your paternal. Yes.
And my mother and my, who of course was my grandmother, and she would say, "You shouldn't have done that," blah 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 blah. And my mother taught me at a very young age. You will always say thank you. You're grateful for it. You know there's something to receiving. You have to learn how to receive. And I've got a nurse colleague right now has had some very difficult times, and I've done some things for her. And she came from a very wealthy environment, and she's having a real hard time with this. And I keep saying to her, just say thank you, just enjoy it. I want to do this for you. And I think I'm forever grateful that my mother taught me.
Oh, truly a gift. But it's really important. I thank you for the example, Joe. A concrete example. And if we haven't learned it, we need to practice it. We need to practice it. Gratefulness. Yes, in the back, and then we'll work. Oh, you've been patient, I think. No, go ahead. And then. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. I wanted to pick up on the lady at the car tag place.
Yes.
She gave a gift when she spoke to him and said you were being efficient.
You're doing your job well.
You're doing your job well, which made him feel good. And what we don't realize oftentimes is when we give to someone else, what is it? We throw the stone in the water, pebble in the water,
Mhm.
ring the wrong enough. And what did he do after that? He felt better, and maybe he smiled. And I just personally had fun on Monday. I had a yard man doing some work, and he was giving me lots of suggestions, etc. And I'm a little political, so I said, "Have you voted?" And he said, "Oh yes, oh yes." I said, "Well, I don't imagine you voted, do I?" He said, "Oh yes, I did." I said, "Oh, you see my bumper sticker." So,
Now we're going to have to, if you keep talking like this, I'm going to have to ask you who's on the bumper sticker, but I'll let it go. We won't go there.
I went on to the grocery store that afternoon, and somehow, it's just like, okay. And so here's the lady stacking apples, and I said, and she said something nice to me. Of course, the employees at Kroger's are encouraged to, be helpful. Is there anything I can do? And so I just said, "Well, have you voted?" "No," she said, "but I've got to get there." And so I gave her some information about how late the polls were open for early voting and that sort of thing. "Well, I'm going to do it." And I bet you I spoke to 5 different people in the store. It's like, somebody gives you something and you just give it.
You respond.
Yeah.
No.
And so it just, and it so brightened his day. So things brighten people's day, and then they do indeed give more.
I think and again, I think the degree to which we as communities have a thoughtfulness and intentionality about not just being nice, quote unquote, but saying, no, it's part of a way of life, that I will be polite, I will, and what I think what I want to sort of name that as is you're saying to this person who may inherently feel like you're either prejudiced against them or lacking in respect for them or whatever, giving the clear message, no, we journey on this earth together, and I value you, I respect you. Someone mentioned earlier the notion of respect, and this is, and I would, and in some ways you're conveying to him, and please do likewise. Do likewise with others. I think that, yes, Dr. Hurl.
I grew up in Missouri River town where my family lived for 130 years. And the thing I remember, there were a lot of characters. The thing I remember is tolerance of the characters. There's a lot of eccentricity.
Yep.
Which was wonderful. And I got out. But I think in many ways, in university life, I've recreated community for myself. I think maybe we can do that in modern life. We can find new communities that are different from the old.
And I want you to be thinking with me, because I'm going to ask you I want you to be thinking, because one person shared with me earlier how really she goes to a big congregation, but where her community in it is a choir. That's her. I want you thinking about where if you had to say, and I realize we could define it and go into ad nauseam, but I just saying the word community. If you had to say, where's my community? I want you to think about where would it be? If you had to just say to yourself, okay, where's my community? Where would it be? And I think, yes?
I just want to add that I feel tremendous nostalgia for that old town.
Yes.
And I can't get rid of it.
Yeah, I know. And maybe you shouldn't. That's right. You don't want to get rid of that. And you make me. I have to tell a side story now that you have mentioned that of the characters in that small town. Of an example and I really do not mean. I'm going to be careful. I do not mean to be idealizing the small town or the what, because we all know the oppressiveness of those potentially, right? But we're wanting to learn and think about how do you have that communal way of life that's not oppressive, that has hospitality, that can move forward, but yet has that communal characteristic, okay? And we're wanting to find that dynamic, how that dynamic tension exists. And I'll never forget it's an example of virtue of hospitality that I share with you in the context of Dr. Hargrove's mentioning a small town, of having grown up in a small town myself, and even out in a small community in regard to a small town, okay? I mean, a small rural community within that. And having been around my grandfather a lot, okay? I mean, when my parents would be, we're both working at that time. My mother taught school, my father was a businessman, etc. And so I would have periods of time, especially in the summers, when I would be with them, with my grandparents, who just, quote, lived up the road and was from a farming type background. And he would have people working with him. And there was one gentleman that now, okay, I'm a psychiatrist now, have trained, and I look back on it, this guy was mentally ill. I mean, this guy clearly had significant mental illness, but he was just, I won't say his name just out of respect for him, but I mean, he was just a character in the community and worked with him, would eat lunch with, I mean, the tradition, I know some of you would know or whatever, is my grandmother would, the hands, quote, the people working with my grandfather would all come in to eat lunch together during the workday. And my grandmother would prepare the meal and have a big, and he was part of it. He would be part of that. Well, at that time, that's a way of life. And he was fed, and he had a life there, and there was a significant capacity for inclusion and acceptance as part of that community. Now, when I look back on it, I realize we don't know how to do that in the context I live now. He would have to be put somewhere, or the notion would be clearly one of exclusion, whereas I understood and interpreted him as a part of the community and a different kind of part of the community, but as someone that could be accepted and included. Very important lesson for me to learn.
Is that where you learned to be a psychiatrist?
Probably. Probably so. I mean, all that comes together with learning how to be a psychiatrist. There are many things that contribute to that, probably. But, excuse me, but I do think it's important, those kind of practices, how we learn to be a community in a variety of ways. So when you mentioning characters makes me think of, yes, ma'am, Ruth.
One thing psychiatrists know for sure now, looking back at communities and or the lack of in this current age, I was born and raised in a tiny town in Appalachia. My mother still lives in the house I was born and raised in. I could walk to all three schools I went to. I could walk to the First Baptist Church where I played piano. I could walk to my daddy's gas station. So what we'd learn in a tiny community like that, because I've always been very social. I knew everybody. I saw what went on behind closed doors. So because I had this encyclopedic range of understanding different personalities, some pathological. Now that I'm out in the world, and my bus has probably been on your street, sometimes I'm in a different city or state every day, they say that coming from that kind of environment sort of imbues you with more of a kindness and openness to other people.
And along with that, though, the notion of that we also, along with them knowing, you knowing them, they knew you. And there's a certain, and I want to remind us of that sort of accountability. Now, I want to quickly go on to, I want to read just a few snippets, and I won't read the whole thing, but I just want to remind, if you didn't have a chance to read, just even page 7, on page 7 out of the Icaria story, because I want to remind us that of sort of the context. Local women gathered in the dining room at mid-morning to gossip over tea. Late at night, after the dinner rush, tables were pushed aside. The dining room became a dance floor, with people locking arms and kick dancing to Greek music. I love the thought of 80-year-olds doing that, okay? And 80-year-olds are young in Icaria, okay? That's still quite youthful. Then it goes on to talk about the savory pies and the healthy eating, all of that, which is good. Please don't get me wrong. But I find it interesting that they continually point out but there's more to it than that. Now, that's a good thing to do. We can all have those practices, but Despite, and then I'm skipping some things just out of the sake of time, Pericos was actually born in Detroit to an American father and Icarian mother, attended high school, worked as a real estate agent, married in the U.S. After she and her husband had their first child, she felt she called a genetic craving for Icaria. I was not unhappy in America. We had good friends. We went out to dinner on the weekends. I drove a Chevrolet. That was probably why she wasn't. No, I'm kidding. But I was always in a hurry. I was always in a hurry, and so she and her family, they moved back to Icaria. She talks about a huge garden, etc. And she said, but we don't. And she talks about the simple diet. Yes, she said, but we don't think about it that way. It's bigger than that. And I think that gets back to this way of life. She's saying, yeah, it's good that we eat a good diet. It's good that we do this, but it's something bigger than that. It's bigger than that. And she was naming it. She goes on to talk about and again, people are fine here because we're very we may not have money for luxuries, but we will have food on the table and still have fun with family and friends. We may not be in a hurry to get work done during the day, so we work into the night. At the end of the day, we don't go home to sit on a couch. She goes on to talk about food here is always enjoyed in combination with conversation. You enjoy the company of whoever you are with. The importance of conversation, a companionship for these sorts of activities. In the United States, let me go to this. Social structure might turn out to be more important. Okay? In Sardinia, a cultural attitude that celebrated the elderly kept them engaged in the community and in extended family homes until they were in their 100s. Studies have linked early retirement among some workers in industrialized companies or economies to reduce life expectancy. Not a surprise to us, but I think it's notable in this context. Instead, the notion of akagia, the reason for which you wake up in the morning, suffuses people's entire adult lives. I want us to think about, and I think it's important when we think about religion and health, communities of faith and practice and health, all these interrelationships we're talking about over these few weeks, I want us to think about the notion of, remember that when I talked about the good, of what do we the reason for which you wake up in the morning. You know, I mean, that gets me, that challenges me. For what reason do I wake up in the morning? And having a notion of that as I continue through life. Purpose, meaning, all the stuff that we talk. But I love it when these folks are just observing. That's what keeps us going. Having a reason for when, and we all go through periods of times when we're not sure maybe of why we're waking up in the morning. But the importance of that, and I believe that is formed within a community and a context such as this. The Nicoyans in Costa Rica use the term plan de vida to describe a lifelong sense of purpose. Dr. Robert Butler, first director of the NIA, once told to be able to define your life meaning adds to your life expectancy. The healthful plant-based diet that Seventh-day Adventists eat has been associated with an extra decade of life expectancy. It has been linked to reduced rates of diabetes and heart disease. Adventist diet is inspired by the Bible, Genesis 1:29, and God said, behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding to seed. To you it shall be for food. But again, the key insight might be more social structure than the diet itself. While for most people diets eventually fail, the Adventists eat the way they do for decades. How do they do that? Why do they maintain these? Adventists hang out with other Adventists. When you go to an Adventist picnic, there's no steak grilling on the barbecue. It's a vegetarian potluck. No one is drinking alcohol or smoking. As Nicholas Christakis, physician and social scientist at Harvard, found when examining data from long-term study of the residents of Framingham, health habits can be as contagious as a cold virus. Among the Adventists we looked at, it was mostly positive social contagions that were in circulation. The notion of a social context, a structure. And for this community in Icaria, I think they captured my attention at least. And so I think can you give me some examples of, when you think of, what's your community? I know choir was one for you. What's other, yes? AA. Great community. 12-step groups are crucial communities. I actually have a quote that's going back to, any other willing to, where's your community? Yes, ma'am.
Vanderbilt Women's Club.
Vanderbilt Women's Club. Wonderful group. Yes, ma'am.
Book clubs.
book clubs, places to read and share ideas about. Yes, there was somebody else in. I thought. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Red Hat Society.
I've heard. Oh, what a good one. Yeah. So great examples. Great examples. Okay, then linking to what was just said and wanted to make the most of our time. This comes back to this book that I mentioned to you once before, God's Hotel, story of a woman's practice of medicine, Victoria Sweet. That I think it's the practice of medicine that many of us who went into medicine 20, 30 years ago yearn for in ways, but our settings don't allow for it now as much. But she captured it in a setting that was caring for those who had nowhere else to turn in the city of San Francisco at one time. But let me just, this quote of Don Taylor's a man who has just died in this story, who was actually, going back to the comment Ms. Judd just made about AA, he was a sponsor in a 12-step group. It took Don Taylor, who had just died, with his enactment of meaning and of love to save Mr. Rapman's life for good. And so the thing that's interesting to me is, again, this is, and let me just give you a little bit of the context of, Mr. Rapman was the last lesson in my schooling at the old Laguna Honda, and I knew it at the time. There was the importance of modern medicine with its intensive care units, transfusions, and antibiotics. And I read this just to remind you, I mean, I work in a tertiary care type hospital every day. That's the context I live in. We've all probably benefited from tertiary care, intensive care units, or transfusions, or antibiotics. And for that I give thanks. Please don't misunderstand me. That's important. Those are gifts. But it's in the type of community within which they are embedded and in which they're lived out that I want to say, though, is crucial to really thinking about this notion of human flourishing together. Without that medical model of care, Mr. Rapman, who has survived and is now the one speaking to the life of this gentleman who's died, would never have survived his fatal liver disease. But modern medicine was not enough. Mr. Rapman also needed the way of Laguna Honda, the way of Hildegard, and pre-modern medicine, tincture of time, the little things, Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Merriman to heal completely. But even that had not been enough, it took Don Taylor with his enactment of meaning and love to save Mr. Rapman's life for good. So meaning and love, what does it mean? What are we talking about? I mean, how can we even talk about love in this current context we live in? Well, when Barry's talking about remember with me back to health as membership, that notion of when literally how it ends, health as membership ends with the nurse giving a hug. The nurse giving, and him saying, maybe this is the starting point. When this love enters a hospital, its existence and the power of its longing have been proved over and over again, even by its defeat. It is superior to whatever happens. What that's saying, and it's kind of chopped there a little bit just due to length of time, is that this notion of a love for the other, a belonging, if in healthcare, if we're going to really get past all the benefits of contemporary medicine, but yet really engage healing and human flourishing, even when we die, because no matter what the intensive care unit at the hospital can do, we will still die. It will happen one way or another. So in that context, when we're seeking human flourishing, even when dying, central to that I'm proposing to you is going to be love, belonging, a place where we have a sense of, yes, I belong here, this is my place in this world, and that we also can give to others within that, and receive, give and receive within that as central to it. Part of this that I reference back to, and I've mentioned Bondi to you once before, I want to emphasize that in case you start to think, oh, well, I can just read about this, I can just read about, because that's our, and I use sometimes the phrase these days of that. Well, just give me the website. People just, you don't even have to bother with giving me a book. Just give me the website, and I'll look it up. I want to challenge us that reading a few books and coming to an intellectual understanding of the reality of our situation cannot deliver us from our wounds. We need real people. There's just not a substitute for it. Real community. real folks who are saying, yes, I love you, and in a way that has a texture and a robustness to it. The kind of communities that I'm wanting to talk, that I'm talking with us about, okay, that I'm proposing, it's as it's been said here a number of times, it's not just any community. Gangs or the mafia are communities, and they're pretty powerful ones for forming people. See, the point I'm wanting to make with formation does happen. We are formed by the communities we live in. Those whether you grew up in New York or you grew up in a small town, or you're formed by the communities. We're all formed by the communities we live in. Now the issue becomes in sometimes discernment about what kind of communities we're going to be. And so when we learn to accept and bear what type of communities, and Worsba is leading us toward a type of community here, when we learn to accept and bear our pain together, okay? A place where we can bear our pain together, we develop habits that best equip us to build communities that acknowledge and celebrate our need for each other. That interdependency. When we fully and without rivalry welcome others, hospitality, even those who seemingly do not have much to offer in return, whether it's the young man at the emissions checking evaluation center or whatever, even those who may not have much to offer in return, we recognize our interdependence and learn the arts of sharing, forgiveness, and gratitude. Communities that will form us for health and human flourishing are communities of forgiveness and gratitude. Communities where acceptance, forgiveness, and gratitude, and an interdependence, and a willingness to give and receive within that community. So the virtues of communities formed in practices of caring that I am convinced will foster a context of human flourishing include gratitude, and I kind of give you some other phrases there to go with it. Gratitude, acceptance, and hope, that I think those link in certain ways. Gratitude, hospitality, and trust. Central virtues to forming communities that will form us for health and human flourishing. Now, I do think some faith communities foster those, and I would put forth to you that can be a central way of religion and health having an interrelationship. Do all faith communities? No, I confess not. Some actually can be lacking in acceptance and hope, can be very inhospitable, and can make people feel like they don't belong at all, right? So I'm acknowledging that to you. But optimally, my hope and trust is that faith communities can embody some of these virtues of communities formed in practices of caring. And quickly, and we may come back to this a little bit, but I want you thinking about, let me just give you, to wrap up here over the last couple, gratitude. I want you pondering gratitude with me. As you read Hannah Coulter, if you haven't read it yet and you're planning to, think about gratitude. When you read through Hannah Coulter, think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if any of you know that name, but a major, I think, saint theologian of the last century in some ways, died a martyr's death at the hands of the Nazis in a concentration camp. I mean, one of my questions before God someday is, why wasn't Bonhoeffer liberated before he was executed? You know, I don't get that. That's one of those, and I'm not supposed to. Please understand.
Because you read it.
I'm sorry?
He was because you read it.
I understand. In ordinary life, we hardly realize that we receive a great deal more than we give, and that it is only with gratitude that life becomes rich. I think there's something there. With gratitude, capacity to say, I don't deserve it, but to give thanks, central to it. And I read this story is so powerful for me, and this is a real story by Robert Emmons, who's a gratitude researcher in California. Starts off, and this is a patient that he interviewed once. I believe life is not always fair, and you might want to say, well, yeah, this guy has ALS. 49-year-old with ALS. I bet he would say it's not always fair, but let's look at what he says. It has certainly been true in my case. It is not fair that I should have wonderful, caring, supportive parents who raised me right and brothers and sisters that are there when I need them. It's not fair that I should be blessed with a beautiful, talented wife, and together we should have 2 equally beautiful, talented daughters who make us proud daily. No, life is not fair. Why should I have so many years of good health and energy and good friends to camp and backpack with through the years? ALS is a terrible disease, but it does not negate the rest of my life. I don't know if I could say that if I had ALS. That's gratitude. That's a gratitude that I want to ponder and I want to think about. Gratitude is at the center of a hospitable heart. If we're going to really, and I want you to think, if we're going to be hospitable to those who are around us and those who especially are somewhat different than we are, first, I think it starts with gratitude. Because if we aren't grateful, if we think we deserved everything we have that's good, then are we going to invite others to share it with us? No. But if we realize that it was all a gift, right? And that we have the privilege of being in these relationships of giving and receiving, and that it was a gift, that life itself is gift in ways, then we're going to invite others in to be part of it, right? So hospitality and gratitude, I think, are centrally related to one another. Trust and belonging. And then the final slide. So this comparison of entitlement of therapeutic individualism, where we started on our first time together, this therapeutic culture of technological utopianism and its presumptions of happiness, in contrast to gratitude, hospitality, and trust, the nurture of communities of human flourishing. What would those look like that embody courage and meaningful formation of the self and give purpose and literally help us, give us communities whereby we get up every day knowing why we're getting up and what we're about that day. We need one another to do that. I need you. I think we're all interdependent for that. That's how this relationship, I think this is the fertile ground of this relationship of religion and health. So read Hannah Coulter with me. Think about gratitude, the inextricable relationship of gratitude and hospitality as we go into our last week together next week. Thank you. Back 4 slides, is that?